Research that resonates.
Schweizer has not been wrong on any of his years and years of reporting on the Bidens.
Investigations that matter.
If your last name wasn't Biden, do you think you would have been asked to be on the board of 𝑏𝒂?
I don't know. Probably not. But that's, I don't think that there's a lot of things that would have happened in my life that if my last name wasn't Biden.
The only entities, the only people that would report on this, and Peter Schweizer, who deserves a Medal of Freedom, in my view.
This is The Drill Down with Peter Schweizer.
Hi, it's Peter Schweizer, and welcome to The Drill Down, where we relentlessly expose cronyism, corruption, and the abuse of power in Washington, D.C. The host of this program, of course, 𝐃𝐫𝐢𝐥𝐥. Eric, we're 1 week away from the 2024 presidential election.
And, not to give too much away, but I think this actually might be our last drill down before the election, because we typically, record these the days that elections are cast on Tuesdays. So we're still trying to figure out some scheduling next week. But there's a decent chance that the next time you hear from us will be the day after the election.
That's right. And what we want to talk about today is, I think, going to be a very interesting subject to everyone, and that is the person that is going to have the biggest influence on this election that you've never heard of. We're not talking about the candidates. We're not talking about the campaign managers. We're not talking about George Soros. We're not talking about big financiers. We are talking about sort of the prince of the master of political dark arts, who is really setting up how this election is going to be carried out. And that, of course, is the super lawyer, Marc Elias.
Mark Elias, a name you may not have heard of, but he may not be George Soros, but he is George Soros adjacent. He is certainly familiar with some of Soros's money, has been for a long time. He's somebody who was featured in my book back in 2018, and whose role has only grown in terms of the way he shapes the manner in which elections are cast, the ways in which names stay on voter rolls, whether they should or shouldn't be, and increasingly a variety of other activities. Just to give you a sense of how involved this guy is. This guy is presented as the champion, the biggest protector of democracy, to the extent that Donald Trump is seen by so many as the biggest threat to democracy, even though he's one of the only presidential candidates, the only presidential candidate who actually won primary votes. That's aside. But Marc Elias is considered to be the great foil to Donald Trump. So he's the person that protects democracy, even though he's involved in things like suing to get Cornel West off the ballot in these key states, and apparently funding ads that support libertarian candidates in other swing states, right? So it's not just about pro-voter, it's clearly a political bent to it, but that's consistent with actually what his career has been like the entire time.
That's right. We're going to talk about his past. He has, I think, a very controversial past with some very prominent cases that people are going to be familiar with. Remember the Al Franken election in 2008. Remember the Russian dossier in 2015. Marc Elias was the central player in all of it. And the reason that he matters, the reason that we're talking about him today is, think about it this way. Think about a sporting event, right? You're watching the World Series, right? The World Series is going on right now, the Dodgers against the Yankees. The players, the focus is on the players. But the umpire and how the rules are interpreted and how the rules are going to be enforced can be crucial in defining who actually wins the game. And Marc Elias's job, I would argue, is to manipulate the laws and the rules to skew them in a direction that benefits his clients. We both know, everybody knows, there are lawyers that do this on both sides of the aisles, Republicans or Democrats, but I would hazard to say nobody could challenge me on the simple statement that Marc Elias has done this more aggressively, more successfully, with more massive results than anybody else operating in this space.
He might send you a check for saying that, actually, because he's got the money. He's got like Sam Bankman-Fried's mom behind him. He's got George Soros behind him. The only thing I will challenge you on is not the statement you made about Marc Elias, but about the World Series being on. By the time people hear this, it might not be. And to be honest, thank you, America, for the Yankees can't. We're all fine with that. But no, I think this is a guy who he was with the Hillary Clinton campaign in 2016. You mentioned the Russian dossier. We'll talk about that. But he's admitted that the Trump's 2016 win radicalized him. And he says, quote, he told the New Yorker in a glowing profile that I became a more polarized person and a more polarizing lawyer. It is election season now. It is many places in this country are still recovering from hurricane season, hurricane damage. And you and I know in Florida, we're used to it. But what we do ahead of hurricanes is they take the utility crews, they take the relief supplies, and they position them in pockets where they can be ready to be deployed where they're needed before the storm comes through. We see it all the time. That's what Democrats and Republicans, to be fair, are doing with lawyers before next week. You found an article in the Wall Street Journal with a stunning statistic of the force of lawyers. We may not be able to get water to North Carolina. FEMA is maybe AWOL in certain key places, but we got some dang lawyers for days for this election next week.
Yeah, we can. I mean, there's a picture of Mark Elias in this Wall Street Journal piece. Democrats try to head off GOP vote lawsuits. What the article points out is that there are right now more than 400 lawyers working for the Democratic Party, largely under the direction of Mark Elias, and they have been writing thousands of pages of legal drafts right now to anticipate challenges to voter results, voter access issues in states, and they have, believe it or not, 10,000 lawyers that are ready to dive in to challenge results. So this is very real. It's not just going to be determined by how the votes are cast, but how they're counted, who counts them, and Elias is the center player in all of this.
And I was actually really impressed earlier because normally you're known for like looking great in a blazer and making outdated cultural references, but you did a little math on this. Put the 10,000 lawyers in context.
Yeah, that's 200 lawyers per state, right? I mean, and of course,
how we weave it in, you know, that's my weave.
Right. And I'm imagining 200 are probably not going to be in Hawaii, although they'd like to be. They're probably going to be in these battleground states. You're talking about thousands, but let's talk about his history. 2008, some people may remember Al Franken, the Saturday Night Live alumni, ran for the Senate in Minnesota and won after, what was it, a 7-month process? And who was at the center of driving that result?
I had forgotten this, by the way, that it was that long. But no, it's like 7 months plus of a recount because they were challenging the election. 2.9 million people vote in Minnesota, and it came down to, by the time they called it, Norm Coleman, who was the incumbent senator, led by 725 votes. So Mark Elias and the team, they did they do a kind of a recount, and then they dragged the lead down to 206, and then this like becomes this thing, and now they're fighting every day,
every single ballot,
over ballots. In the end, after months of fighting, he was sworn in. I mean, think about this: elections happened in November of 2008.
Yeah.
Al Franken wasn't sworn into office until July of 2009.
Amazing.
So this 9-month thing, Al Franken is slow and deliberate. And so it took 8 months for him to be sworn in. By the way, not for nothing, Al Franken now does a podcast where he recently interviewed Mark Elias. I listened to that to try to do a little bit of research on this. If you want to know what Al Franken's podcast is like, it's like a warm glass of soy milk, put it in a knit sweater, give it some Zoloft, and then send it to an Indigo Girls concert. Like, that's a decent swath of, I think, his fan base, and that's his podcast. But the point is, that's who he is today. Back then, he was this up-and-coming, he's kind of the pseudo-celebrity type, but there's this extended recount process.
Yeah.
In the end of it, he ends up winning, Al Franken does, by 312 votes. Later, people reported they thought they found evidence of over 1,000 potentially illegal votes being cast in that election, which may have contributed to Al Franken's Senate election, which, by the way, would have come because of Mark Elias's protection and legal efforts.
And this is the point. He gets results. He's aggressive. These are the dark arts. I mean, the way that you switch a 300-vote lead to a 200-vote majority. I also remember in that case, by the way, there were reports that there were cars pulling up with ballots in the trunks of the cars that were being brought into certain locations. But the point is, that's what put Mark Elias on the stage as an aggressive Democratic lawyer that gets results. He quickly became enmeshed in sort of the center point of the Democratic Party establishment. Everybody was paying him to be the aggressive lawyer. And he makes another big appearance in 2015. This is, of course, when the Clintons decide that they're going to launch the Russia smear, right? They're going to go after Donald Trump and say that he is actually a Russian agent. And the way they do this, by the way, is they pay Mark Elias's firm, Perkins Coie, for quote-unquote legal services.
Mega firm in D.C. It's important to remember he was with Perkins Coie because he is no longer, partly because of this incident.
Yes, exactly. But they pay him, quote, for legal services, money, which he uses that money to then hire Fusion GPS, which is this firm run by the disgraced former British agent, to come up with a fake dossier on Donald Trump, which is then circulated around the media, which then, of course, engrips the media and the FBI and everybody else. Ends up being totally fake, totally false. That was Marc Elias. He carried it out with precision. He carried it out, I'm sure, not giving a lot of credence to the allegations in this memo. He certainly had to know there was no sourcing behind it. And this was another example of what Marc Elias said, and it almost affected the outcome in 2016 and was the shadow that was hanging over the Trump administration for 3 years because of the actions of this lawyer.
Yeah, the idea that Trump would be a Russian asset came from this, which was totally fabricated. There's something we'll say about that in a second. But it's worth pointing out that to Mark Elias's role in it, during the investigation of Russiagate, Special Counsel John Durham found Elias intentionally sought to conceal Clinton's role in the dossier. He acted as a cutout for more than $1 million in campaign payments for the dossier. He essentially laundered the payments through their law firm. It was the kind of stuff that, number one, Donald Trump has been charged for doing that with the Stormy Daniels payments. But number two, it got Hillary Clinton a $113,000 fine from the Federal Election Commission. So, I mean, the stuff Donald Trump has been charged with, Marc Elias participated in, essentially, just with a different outcome, which maybe speaks to his skill as an attorney.
Right.
The other thing worth pointing out, by the way, the whole reason the Hillary Clinton people came up with this Russia fabrication is because of a book called Clinton Cash, which you wrote, which actually highlighted the very real and legitimate connections that Hillary Clinton had to Vladimir Putin through Uranium One. That's why they say this is our biggest vulnerability. We need to create this narrative. They did that. Marc Elias participated in that, got them fined, got Donald Trump charged, and did a similar thing. But Marc Elias, bad then too.
Yeah. And this is the thing. He's aggressive. He gets results. He knows how to work the system. As a result of that, by the way, in the investigation that came out later, Perkins Coie and Marc Elias parted ways, as they say. And there were a lot of murmurings that the firm did not like or appreciate the negative attention they got for the manner in which he moved that money around and concealed the Clintons' involvement and concealed the fact that these were not legal services at all that he was performing. These were the dark arts of politics. So this is what makes Marc Elias so successful. So let's talk about now. That's a little bit of the history of Marc Elias.
Yeah.
You have done a lot of work on election fraud and the way in which lawyers can influence electoral outcomes. You've got ballot access. You've got ballot counting. You've got redistricting. I'm probably missing a couple, but give them a flavor of the sort of things that Marc Elias is doing and the success that he's having.
So he's having some success in Wisconsin specifically, where they've employed a strategy called Sue Until Blue, which just sounds fun, if we're honest. It just is a good time. It's like, what are you going to do tonight? Well, maybe a little blue suing. I don't know. See what's on Netflix.
I love it.
But like the things that they are on, like that they are kind of paying attention to, and these are the stakes that all these lawyers are involved. Marc Elias, I think there's like 60 active lawsuits happening right now that he has filed to try to stop Trump from, doing things to make the election rolls more secure. But it's everything from how late can you count ballots in Nevada and Mississippi to whether you can use drop boxes in Wisconsin. That's what they've been successful for. And there's even some lawsuits over what kind of ID college students in North Carolina can use. There was a ruling that said they could use a digital ID, and that's since been overturned. But, the biggest thing for me is the stuff like drop boxes, because drop boxes are in the post-2020 COVID ballot era. Drop boxes are, in my opinion, one of the bigger threats to accurate elections. We did an analysis of what Georgia did, and there's the film 2000 Mules, and they showed just there's questions about what happens when you have unmonitored drop boxes in key locations. What we've paid attention to is where these drop boxes actually get deployed. In 23 Dropbox locations they put in Gwinnett County, which is outside of Atlanta. 19 of them were put in places that are heavy for Biden, and they did the same thing in Fulton County. Eventually, they put 20 drop boxes during a primary. 17 of them went to like heavy Biden districts. So like they put them specifically, hey, here's where we know the Biden voters are.
It's easy for blue voters to vote and harder for
then after the primary, right, for the general one was just Biden versus Trump, they added 17 more drop boxes. This is in Georgia, but this just speaks to the strategy behind how they use drop boxes. 16 of the 17 they added for the general in Georgia were located in precincts that Biden would win. 9 of those he'd win by over 90% of the vote. So the point is, drop boxes, they're not monitored. It's more separation between the voter and the ballot and everything else, and it's like unclear. You talk about ID laws. There's no law. There's no monitoring of like who's putting that ballot, how many ballots are putting in. So that's why they're a problem. those are among the reasons why Wisconsin in 2022 said, hey, you're right, we shouldn't do drop boxes. Supreme Court tilted a little Republican, so they said, okay, you can still cast an absentee ballot, but you got to give it to a person or the clerk, just not to this inanimate object. And then the court changed, and because Mark Elias is a good lawyer, he brought the same lawsuit with no new circumstances, and this time the new Wisconsin Supreme Court said, okay, cool, let's do it.
Yeah.
And so that's the reason why 4 of Wisconsin's largest cities next week are going to use drop boxes: Wisconsin, Milwaukee, Madison, Green Bay, and Racine. But the good news is that because of the controversy that I think anybody that's paying attention has seen, there at least is now an effort to say, a lot of places are choosing not to use them, which they did 4 years ago,
right,
for the security reasons that I think are legitimately raised. And they're also going to say, okay, if we're going to use them, then we're going to have video on them. We're going to have volunteers, offer to come stand near them and just watch to make sure only one ballot goes in, because ballot harvesting is not legal in Wisconsin. So, but the point is, drop boxes weren't legal, period, in 2022 because of a court ruling. Mark Elias says, you know what, let's see what we can do, and they were able to change that.
Yeah, and look, in some of these states, we could be talking about razor-thin majorities one way or the other. Who knows? It's hard to predict, but these are all things that have an effect and that are changing the rules, as it were. The sporting analogy, you're changing the rules as you go along in the match, and you're skewing the rules in a way that leads to less election integrity and more beneficial to one side. So now, Mark Elias was with the Biden campaign in 2020, but then they kind of parted ways, but now he got rehired by Kamala Harris. What was that all about?
Well, he's got this long-standing relationship with Kamala Harris. She actually thanked him in her book in 2019. I know you read a lot of books. Did you catch the Kamala Harris book?
I did not.
By the way, can we just say, there's one thing I'm going to miss.
Is this the one that was plagiarized, by the way? Remember?
That was like an 06 book, I think.
Okay.
And that, I want to know.
This is you're talking about her life story. It's hard to plagiarize your own life story.
Well, that's why the McDonald's references are key for it. But we're just gonna miss the way Donald Trump says Kamala, right? Like that's like we're all in agreement there.
Right.
Kamala. It's just good. But yeah, so he got her. He's representing her. He represented her. I guess her primary campaign in 2020. Yeah. So he's been hired by her. He's been hired by like the Lincoln Project. He's got gigs with Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, the Stop Trump PAC. And so, it's funny because he's been hired by these people, even though the reason why the Bidens got rid of him is because his tactics are, number one, questionable from a PR standpoint. Like an analysis said that Mark Elias' efforts have weakened election integrity, and he's drawn the ire of the White House for several reasons, including poor communication, poor strategies, and his prices and his political antics, including what he does on social media.
Wait. Prices? Lawyers actually overcharge? I've never heard that before.
I don't want to get sued, so it's it's an eye. Look, if you got Sam Bankman-Fried's mom cutting a check, you price yourself a certain way.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is like real lawyers say what he does, because he's so aggressive, and some would say frivolous, is it actually, when you bring a bad lawsuit, it actually allows courts to make rulings that then lead to further case law, which in the eyes of actual voting rights advocates say it actually makes it harder to allow people to vote. So like in 2016, he sued Arizona to strike down 2 laws that he said made it harder for blacks and Hispanics to vote. One was about basically ballot harvesting, and the other one was about canceling ballots that are cast at the wrong precinct. I mean, that's the kind of stuff he's like, oh, it doesn't matter. You're at the wrong place. Like, just count it anyway.
Yeah.
And they're like, well, rules exist. We have, like, at some point there has to be a rule about who can and cannot cast the ballot.
And a consistent rule.
Yeah, and a consistent rule. But he'll challenge anything. And so when you challenge it and you lose, then that creates case law. And the Republican lawyers are like, see, you said you couldn't do this here, so that means you can't do that there.
Right. So a lot of the litigation that he's engaged in has been in this area of how votes are going to be counted, how votes can be cast, issues related to ballot harvesting, et cetera. Another area has been redistricting. And this is another example of how Mark Elias has had this enormous effect, I would argue, on the composition of our government through his aggressive litigation. He was one of the first on the national stage in the early 2010s to start suing over redistricting, claiming that the way districts were drawn in Virginia, North Carolina, Alabama, and elsewhere were racist or were unfair to certain groups. And this resulted in the state of Virginia in flipping it's believed 3 congressional seats from the Republicans to the Democrats, and flipping 2 in North Carolina. And he's had this effect elsewhere. So it's not just the vote counting, it's actually who your representative is, how districts are drawn. He's aggressive about it. He's relentless about it. The Republicans don't always seem to have an answer for him. And it's another example of how Mark Elias has, I think, had this enormous effect on the outcomes of our elections. And most of the people listening to this podcast don't know who he is.
Now, one thing that I will say that if there's good news, you're right, most people don't know who he is, but if there's good news, he has said that maybe 4 years ago, Republicans, it's funny because Saturday Night Live makes fun of Kamala for being like the vibes campaign.
Yeah.
But Donald Trump is totally a vibes campaign. I mean, right? You've got like the Democrat get out the vote operation. I think generally people agree is more sophisticated, partly because of the effort of Mark Elias.
Yeah.
Trump's going to like Madison Square Garden and hiring comedians. And like, we got this, guys.
Right.
But all that to say is I think that, Elias has said that they're taking it more seriously. They have better attorneys. 4 years ago, you had Rudy Giuliani in parking lots of gardening centers.
Right.
Now you have a whole professional operation of attorneys. And so they've filed a bunch of lawsuits on the front end, and they also appear equipped to be able to kind of fight and litigate on the back end. So I do think that, 4 years ago, just think about this, like 4 years ago, everything from stuff about Hunter Biden's laptop was censored, and you couldn't even really raise questions about how we're counting ballots because it was COVID and global pandemic, and we're kind of just letting everything go.
Yeah.
And then everyone's like, okay, that was probably too much. And that's why Georgia passed the law, and they were able to stand up to the accusations of being racist, and they lost their dang all-star game because of it. But people have taken efforts and steps to say, even in Wisconsin, they say, look, we get that the Dropbox thing became politicized. It makes us sick. So we're doing whatever we can to like add the security and integrity element to be paired with the access.
Right.
So I do think it's swung back the other way in a positive way for election integrity.
Yeah, that's right. And look, Mark Elias is a lawyer. He has a right to engage in litigation. Republicans are doing the same thing. So it's not that what Mark Elias is doing wrong. I think the concern is the aggressive nature, the sort of no holds barred nature of it. The fact that he tries to skew and hide things like he did with the dossier, make him so successful, and I think make him overly successful in his influence on this elections, when we want to have elections decided by voters and by people, not by lawyers who are, I would argue, manipulating the rules to benefit one side.
By the way, the skewing and the hiding stuff. So we mentioned how he's behind these libertarian candidate ads in these swing states. So there's a group called Civic Truth Action. It's a super PAC that was just launched in July, and they've dropped $1.5 million on ads supporting. Do you know who the libertarian candidate is
for president?
Yeah,
no,
me neither. Apparently, it's a dude named Chase Oliver. And this group has aired dozens of YouTube ads in like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Nevada, these key swing states. And so they have a sole backer, this dark money outfit called Evidence for Impact, who's given over $4 million to this group.
Right.
Now, records obtained by the Washington Free Beacons show that the only person connected to this money group, the Evidence for Impact, is somebody named Ezra Reese. Ezra Reese is an attorney. I'll give you $10 if you can guess who he works for.
He works for Mark Elias?
He works for the Elias Law Group.
So Mark Elias is perhaps now a libertarian. Is that what you're telling me?
I mean, that's what's possibly. He hates Cornell. Here's the irony. A guy who has sued states all over the country over laws he claims are racist is doing his best to get the one like black candidate, Cornel West, off the ballot.
Right. Because presumably he's going to eat into Kamala's support and affect him in swing states, whereas the libertarian potentially would draw more voters from Donald Trump than they would from Kamala Harris. Hence, that's where Mark Elias comes out on these third parties.
I'm not saying he's a hypocrite. All I'm saying is Mark Elias is suing to get the black guy off the ballot, and he spends a lot of time with Al Franken, who is like the whitest dude you could know. He's like, you hear Minnesota nice. Al Franken is Minnesota white.
Well, we hope that you've learned a little bit about some of the things that are at play in this election. It's about candidates, it's about messaging, it's about getting out to vote, but it's also about trying to skew the rules and manipulate the system for your benefit. I would argue Mark Elias has done that better than anyone else and deserves more attention like this for the sorts of things that he's skewing the election. By the way, I have to get your take on the fact I just read in the paper recently. We've done a lot on Tim Walz. Mm-hmm. Turns out that Tim Walz had a sweetheart in China that was politically connected.
Now, you think that's a legitimate thing?
It seems to be. I mean, look, I haven't verified the story itself. It was run by the Daily Mail. Presumably, they had lawyers look at it. They have some sourcing. But we've done a lot about Tim Walz and concerns about his ties to China, his sympathies towards China. Do you place any stake that this is a story that matters, that people should be concerned about?
Not really. I mean, it
was a while ago.
It was a while ago. It was before he met his wife. Actually, it's sort of the tragedy. And if you read the article and you read the account of this woman, she thinks old Timmy Walz is going to be her ticket to come to the United States. And he's like, oh, we just care about your green card. You don't really care about me. She goes, bro, you live in Nebraska. I'm not trying to. Nobody in China wants to go to Nebraska. I love you and your great sense of humor and clearly familiarity with weapons. And so I feel bad for her. It is, it's a weird kind of thing to come out with, but I think it does speak to his affinity for all things Chinese.
Well, and also, look, this is the way that the Chinese intelligence services operate. I don't know that this is what happened in this case, but she was a politically connected person. Her father was a senior ranking CCP official. And this is what they do. They look for vulnerable Westerners. I don't know if that was the case here, but it certainly fits the modus operandi of the way the Chinese intelligence service operates.
The biggest shock for me is that in 1989, you hear all this stuff about China and like how totalitarian it can be in terms of its lockdown and exemption of cultural access. Apparently, you can listen to George Michael's in China.
He's safe.
Careless Whisper.
Yeah,
Careless Whisper.
That was their love song.
So let me ask you this as we wrap up our last episode before the election. By the time you hear us, we'll just be talking about what we know. Maybe we know results. Maybe we don't. You are terrible at predictions.
I'm horrible.
As evidenced by your stock transactions as it relates to cryptocurrency. But given that, what do you,
among other things,
we can make Schweizer portfolio jokes. It's a good show, guys. It's a good show. What do you think happens next week?
Well, I'm terrible at predicting these elections, I'll tell you. I thought Trump was going to win in 2020. I thought Hillary was going to win in 2016. I'm not making this up. I thought Romney was going to win in 2012, and I thought McCain was going to win in 2008. I've been wrong every single time, so I'm not sure you want me to make a prediction.
And you thought that oil rig in Louisiana was going to work out.
It did. I got to get a tax deduction on that, though. But in all seriousness, it seems like things are trending towards Trump in the swing states. A lot of swing voters decide at the end, and the conventional wisdom is that if swing voters have not decided a month before the election and they're still up for grabs, 2/3 of them are going to go for the non-incumbent because they're not sold on the person.
But we don't really have like a historic precedent for that, right? Is Trump an incumbent?
Well, he is in the sense that the recent economic record is hers. It's not his.
Okay.
That's what the argument would be. So I think things are trending in that direction. Look, a lot of it comes down to what we've been talking about, how votes are counted, which votes are included. Do a bunch of unmarked undated ballots that aren't signed just show up in a state and suddenly 400 votes show up for, the Harris campaign, for example. I mean, you don't know. So those are the concerns that you have. But it seems like the polling and the betting markets are looking to a Trump victory. We'll have to see. It could be narrow. It could be large. It's very, very unpredictable, I think.
I was reminded.
What about you, by the way? I'm not going to let you get out of this without predicting.
Well, I would say this. If Trump wins, I think it's because of the lessons we learned from 4 years ago. And you talk about like what happened in Georgia, and you just like everything that happened in 2020, you kind of just go with it because it's like, this is what we're doing. We're told to do this. I saw the picture of a dude in a mask with binoculars at a polling, right? He's like watching votes get counted from across the warehouse because that's like how we did it.
Yeah.
And I just think that that's not how we're going to do it now. I think that they've put in safeguards in place because
you got a lot of confidence, right? You think they have safeguards in place in Philadelphia and Milwaukee and these big cities we talked about before?
I think they have more safeguards in place, and I think that
they have some more,
Yeah, and I think they kind of, whatever you think happened 4 years ago, let's just say it was fairly brazen and aggressive.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just sort of dismissive too. Like, this is what we did. Yeah, ballots popped up. This is what we stopped.
So what
counting.
stops them from doing that again in your mind? Especially, the analysis we gave before, which I think is true. It's coming down to 4 or 5 states and big urban areas in 4 or 5 states: Philadelphia, Milwaukee, Detroit. I mean, why couldn't they be brazen again?
So
what's to stop them?
So listen, I did a book. I mean, I'll just tell you, my book called "Fraud: How the Left Plans to Steal the Next Election" came out in 2018. And as much as I like to joke about like my poor book sales, Voter fraud was not a topic on people's minds. In fact, Rick Wilson, who is now at the Lincoln Project, his book came out on the same day as mine. And in his book, it said something about, like, there's a phrase about voter fraud's a one-off, it's a fever dream, it's not a real thing. And so, that was, I think, the mainstream perspective about election integrity issues 6 years ago. I do not think that is how people view the issue anymore. In fact, the statistics and the polling suggest the opposite's true. I think 33% of Americans had major questions about the 2020 election, and a vast majority of Republicans. So I think it's something that people are taking much more seriously and have taken much more seriously over the last 4 years. So I do think it's not something that people will dismiss. I mean, people came up to me in 2018, like lawyers and judges and police officers, like, listen, I think it's a real thing, but the juice isn't worth the squeeze. This is not something we take seriously. Ron DeSantis in Florida has a whole task force. They will go get you out of bed at 2 a.m. if you cast an illegal ballot. I mean, so there's been an overcorrection the other way. And I just think that will matter. And I will say, I think if Trump does win, I think that part of the reason he will win is because we take election integrity much more seriously and unapologetically. Like, think about the word you just used from Marc Elias. Anytime what's the word they use if you try to enforce election integrity measures? Racist.
Yeah.
And then you had a state say, you know what? Fine, you can call us racist, but we'll lose our baseball all-star game. But we're going to pass meaningful election integrity law. And other states have done that, and I think that at the local level, people take it seriously, and I think that matters.
Your prediction?
I think Trump wins.
Okay. All right, good. Well, we'll see. I'm terrible at this. You're probably better at than I am.
I'm also terrible.
We'll see, but we appreciate you, as always, taking the time to listen to this podcast. We appreciate your comments and your input. Please go to thedrilldown.com, our webpage. Please contact through the GAI website if you have a tip of something you want us to investigate. And we appreciate you all taking this time to listen. Please do get out and vote. And until next time, thank you very much.